Good evening, seekers. There are places in the ancient world where the landscape seems to have been arranged around the sky, where enormous stones rise from fields, hillsides, and open plains, as though the people who placed them there were trying to preserve something they had learned by watching the heavens. Thousands of years after those builders disappeared, the stones remain beneath the same sun and stars, their ceremonies ended and their spoken meanings mostly lost. Yet, their positions can still be measured, their openings can still catch the light, and the horizons they face can still be watched. It is natural to begin by wondering how such monuments were built, because their weight and scale immediately command attention, but once that first astonishment fades, another question begins to take its place, because these stones were not raised without thought. Their builders chose where they would stand, decided which direction passages would face, and in some places created structures in which sunlight enters at moments so precise that the same event can still be witnessed today. For people living without clocks, printed calendars, or electric light, the sky was woven into ordinary life so completely that observing it would not have felt like a separate science. The sun shifted gradually along the horizon as the year passed, reaching one extreme before beginning its slow return, while the length of daylight changed with the seasons in a rhythm that could be recognized over a lifetime. The moon moved through its own cycle, while familiar stars appeared during one part of the year and faded during another, so that the heavens, although immense and mysterious, also revealed patterns that returned again and again. A person did not need to understand orbits or planetary motion to notice that repetition, and once repetition was noticed, memory could begin to organize it. A sunrise could become associated with cold, rain, planting, harvest, migration, or ceremony, not because ancient people divided these things into neat categories, but because the changing sky and the changing world were experienced together. Perhaps the first connection between stone and sky began in that slow accumulation of remembered mornings, when one generation noticed where the sun appeared at a certain time of year, and another generation learned to recognize the same place. A distant hill, a notch between ridges, or a carefully positioned marker could preserve that memory, and over time, the landscape itself could become a kind of record. When larger monuments were eventually built, those old observations may have been woven into structures that carried practical, social, and sacred meaning at once, because an alignment toward a sunrise did not have to be merely a calendar in the modern sense. The return of light after the longest nights could mark a season, while also belonging to ceremonies, ancestors, stories, or beliefs about renewal, and a chamber illuminated only at a certain time of year could transform an ordinary event in the sky into something experienced as extraordinary on the ground. This is why the stones become more interesting when we stop treating them only as engineering puzzles, because the real mystery is not simply how people moved them, but what those positions meant to the people who chose them. At the same time, the silence surrounding these monuments can tempt us to make every alignment more mysterious than the evidence allows, and that is where caution becomes important. Not every line between stones was intended to point toward a star, and even where an astronomical relationship is clear, knowing that people watched the sky does not automatically tell us why that relationship mattered to them. Archaeology can show us where a monument stood, how it changed over time, and whether sunlight or moonlight reaches it in a repeatable way, but eventually we reach the edge of what measurement can recover, because the final meaning belonged to people whose voices are gone. That uncertainty does not weaken the story, and in many ways it makes these places more compelling, because what survives is enough to show careful observation without giving us the comfort of complete explanation. As we move through this chapter, we will follow the evidence where it leads, from stones and chambers toward horizons and seasonal light, asking not whether ancient people possessed impossible knowledge, but how much could be learned by watching the same sky for generations. Beneath nights far darker than most of us know today, people saw patterns return, remembered them, taught them, and sometimes chose to give that memory a physical form, so that something once noticed in sunlight, shadow, and the turning heavens could remain fixed in stone long after the original observers were gone. Section 2. If there is one place where the relationship between stone and sky has entered the modern imagination more completely than almost anywhere else, it is Stonehenge, standing on the chalk plain of southern England beneath a horizon that still feels unusually open. The monument we see today is only the surviving heart of a much larger prehistoric landscape. And that matters because Stonehenge was never simply an isolated ring of stones placed in an empty field. Around it were burial mounds, earthworks, pathways, and other places used by communities over many generations, so the familiar circle was part of a world that had been shaped slowly rather than designed all at once. Its construction unfolded in stages across centuries, and by the time the great stones were raised, the site already carried a long history of gathering, burial, memory, and ritual. What makes the monument especially important to our story is the direction in which its main axis faces, because the arrangement connects the interior of Stonehenge with the rising sun around the summer solstice and the setting sun around the winter solstice. The effect is not hidden in some obscure measurement available only to modern surveyors, because it can still be experienced directly from the ground when the sun approaches those extreme points of the year. This does not mean that Stonehenge was simply a prehistoric calendar with stones standing in place of numbers, and it certainly does not tell us that everyone who entered the monument understood its purpose in the same way. But it does show that the builders were capable of organizing monumental architecture around the annual movement of the sun. To create such an alignment, people had to know where the sun would appear, which means the horizon had already been watched long before the stones were finished. The winter sunset may have been especially important, although the surviving monument cannot tell us exactly why. For communities living through the coldest and darkest part of the year, the winter solstice marked the point at which the sun had reached its furthest setting position, and the days would slowly begin to lengthen again. So the event carried an obvious seasonal importance even before any religious meaning was attached to it. Evidence from the surrounding landscape also suggests that people gathered in this region during the winter season, which has encouraged the idea that Stonehenge may have been connected with ceremonies held at that time of year. Yet, the more interesting possibility is that the movement of the sun became part of a larger experience involving community, ancestry, renewal, and memory. There is something almost deceptive about the simplicity of watching a solstice, because the event itself requires no advanced instrument. If someone stands in the same place and watches the sunrise or sunset over many months, the changing position becomes visible, and eventually the sun reaches a point where its movement seems to stop before reversing direction. The word solstice comes from a much later language, but the experience it describes would have been available to anyone with patience, memory, and a stable horizon. The sophistication lies not in possessing secret knowledge, but in preserving observation over time and then incorporating it into architecture on a scale that demanded enormous cooperation. Stonehenge therefore reminds us that ancient intelligence should not be measured by how closely people resembled modern scientists, because their achievement was rooted in repeated experience, shared tradition, and collective labor. Even the stones themselves deepen that sense of continuity, because moving and raising them would have required planning, labor, and a reason strong enough to justify the effort. Once standing, they did more than create walls or boundaries, because they framed views and turned the changing sky into something that could be encountered through architecture. A person approaching the monument at the right time of year would not simply see the sun setting somewhere in the distance, but would see that light held within a structure made by human hands, so that a predictable event in the heavens became part of a place built for memory. This is where Stonehenge becomes most useful to us, not because it solves the mystery of ancient astronomy, but because it shows how little separation there may have been between observing the sky and creating meaning from it. The builders left behind no text explaining the solstice axis or recording the ceremonies that may have taken place there, and perhaps they would not have understood our desire to separate those things anyway. For them, the returning sun may have belonged to the same world as the dead, the seasons, the land, and the community gathered among the stones. What survives is the architecture, and through it we can still face the same horizon and watch the sun arrive where they expected it. Section 3. If Stonehenge allows us to watch the sun meet stone across an open horizon, Newgrange draws that same relationship inward, carrying the light of midwinter into darkness. The Great Passage Tomb stands within the bend of the River Boyne in Ireland, part of a prehistoric landscape shaped more than 5,000 years ago, and from the outside, its enormous mound gives little warning of what happens within. A narrow passage leads toward a chamber deep inside the monument, while above the entrance sits a small opening often called the roof box, positioned so that on mornings around the winter solstice, the rising sun can send a beam of light along the passage and into the chamber. For most of the year, that inner space remains beyond the direct reach of the sunrise, but near the shortest days, when darkness has occupied more of the day than at any other time, the light returns and reaches into the heart of the mound. The effect is powerful precisely because it unfolds so slowly. At first, there is only the dim interior, the stone walls, and the narrow passage looking outward toward a cold winter horizon. And then the rising sun begins to find the opening above the doorway. The beam moves inward, lengthening through the passage until the chamber itself is illuminated for a brief time, turning an event that happens every morning into something that could only be experienced there at a particular season. The builders did not merely face an entrance toward the southeast and hope for the best, because the relationship between the roof box, the passage, the chamber, and the horizon was built into the monument itself. Whatever meaning they attached to that moment has not survived in words, yet the architecture preserves enough of their intention for the phenomenon to continue more than 5 millennia later. That endurance changes the way we think about ancient observation, because Newgrange was created long before anyone in that landscape could leave behind a written explanation of the sun's movement. The knowledge required to recognize the returning midwinter sunrise had to live first in people, in memories repeated from one year to the next, perhaps carried across generations before it was ever translated into architecture. Someone had to know where the sun would rise when the year reached its darkest turning, and that knowledge had to remain reliable enough for a community to invest extraordinary labor in a monument whose interior depended upon it. We do not need to imagine a forgotten science to appreciate what this means, because patient observation is itself a form of knowledge, and when observation is preserved through tradition, it can become far more precise than we sometimes expect from societies that left no equations behind. The chamber also reminds us that the sky was not necessarily being observed for practical reasons alone. Newgrange is a passage tomb, a place associated with the dead, and the arrival of sunlight within such a space has naturally encouraged generations of scholars and visitors to wonder whether the midwinter illumination carried ideas of renewal, return, ancestry, or the persistence of life through darkness. Those interpretations cannot be recovered with certainty, and we should not pretend to hear beliefs that were never written down, but the setting itself makes it difficult to imagine the light as meaningless. A community had created a place where the sun, at the darkest point of the year, entered a chamber connected with death, and whether the moment was understood through ceremony, story, memory, or something we no longer have words for, the architecture brought the movement of the heavens into direct contact with human mortality. Perhaps this is why Newgrange feels different from simply standing outside and watching a solstice sunrise, because here the horizon has been transformed into an event that unfolds inside the earth. The rising sun is gathered through a small opening, guided through a corridor of stone, and allowed to enter a chamber that would otherwise remain dark, so that architecture seems to give shape to the return of light itself. Nothing supernatural is required for the experience to feel profound, because the wonder lies in knowing that people observed this pattern thousands of years ago, understood it well enough to build around it, and left behind a structure that still responds to the sky in the way they intended. The builders are gone, their language and ceremonies lost, but for a few winter mornings the monument continues to perform the same quiet act, allowing sunlight to travel through darkness and reach the place they prepared for it. Section 4. Leaving the Green River Valley of Ireland behind, our path turns south into the Mediterranean, where the islands of Malta rise from a sea that has carried travelers for thousands of years. Here, long before the great temples of Egypt and the classical cities that later dominated the Mediterranean world, communities of the late Neolithic built extraordinary stone sanctuaries from the pale limestone beneath their feet. Among them are the neighboring complexes of Hagar Kim and Mnajdra, standing on a rugged coast where the horizon opens toward the sea and the rising sun can be watched with unusual clarity. The buildings do not resemble Stonehenge or Newgrange, yet here again, stone and sunlight were brought into a relationship precise enough that it can still be observed today. Mnajdra's southern building is oriented toward the rising sun in ways that distinguish the equinoxes from the solstices, allowing the movement of light across particular stones to change as the year turns. To imagine the effect as it may once have been experienced, it helps to forget the modern language of astronomy for a moment and picture the temple before dawn, when the chambers would have been cool and dim and the sea beyond the entrance still hidden in darkness. As the eastern horizon brightened, the first sunlight would begin to reach the structure, but its path through the entrance would not remain the same throughout the year. Around the equinoxes, the rising sun enters more directly through the main doorway and carries light along the central passage, while near the solstices, its rays strike different sides of the interior, making the architecture itself respond to the sun's changing position. Nothing within that experience requires us to imagine the builders calculating the heavens as a modern astronomer might, because the pattern could be discovered simply by returning to the same place and watching how dawn changed with the seasons. What matters is that the pattern was noticed closely enough to become part of a monument meant to endure. The setting makes that relationship feel especially natural, because these were communities whose lives depended upon changes in the world around them, and the movement of the sun offered a rhythm larger and more dependable than any single human life. The people who used these temples were living within those cycles, watching daylight lengthen and shorten, while the same bright point traveled back and forth along the horizon. If certain mornings became important enough to gather people together, then the architecture could do more than mark time, because it could make the turning of the year visible inside a place already filled with communal meaning. Heritage Malta has noted the likely importance of changing seasons to the farming communities who built and used these monuments, although the beliefs attached to those seasonal events can no longer be recovered with confidence. There is something important in that uncertainty, because calling Mnajdra a prehistoric solar calendar can make the monument sound more mechanical than it probably was. A calendar, to us, is an instrument for dividing time into units, but an ancient building touched by sunrise may have expressed something much richer, in which the return of a season, the gathering of a community, and the sacred character of a place belonged to the same experience. The beam of light was not necessarily useful because it told people something they did not already know. Anyone living through the changing year could feel winter approaching or recognize the return of warmth. Its importance may instead have come from giving that change a place, allowing something vast and distant in the heavens to enter a human-built chamber and become part of a ceremony whose details are now beyond our reach. When we compare Malta with the monuments we have already visited, the resemblance lies less in architecture than in attention. Newgrange carries the winter sunrise into darkness, Stonehenge frames the sun across an open landscape, and Mnajdra allows the changing position of dawn to reveal itself within the structure as the seasons turn. Yet none of these places needs to have shared a single belief for the comparison to matter. What connects them is the quieter fact that people in very different landscapes learned that the heavens could be watched patiently enough for their repeating movements to become part of architecture. The stones did not bring order to the sky because the order was already there. They gave human beings a way to stand inside that order, to mark it in a place they could return to, and perhaps to feel for a moment that the rhythm above them and the life around them belonged to the same world. Section 5. As the Mediterranean fades behind us and the landscape of Central Europe opens into broad fields and low horizons, the story of ancient sky watching takes on a different form, because not every monument built around the heavens was made from stone. At Goseck, in what is now Germany, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a circular enclosure dating to the early 5th millennium before the Common Era, formed by concentric ditches and wooden palisades that once stood against the sky like a great ring drawn across the land. Much of the original structure had vanished long before it was rediscovered, leaving only traces beneath the soil. Yet the arrangement of its openings revealed a relationship with the rising and setting sun around the winter solstice, suggesting that the builders had shaped the enclosure around a moment when daylight reached its shortest span and the sun seemed to begin its return toward longer days. The material may have been different from the stone monuments we have already visited, but the underlying act feels familiar because someone had to stand in that landscape and learn the horizon before the enclosure could be built around it. The sun's movement is slow enough that a single day reveals almost nothing, and the shift becomes meaningful only when observations are carried across weeks, seasons, and years, which means the architecture at Goseck points toward a patience that is easy to underestimate. The people who lived there did not need to know why the earth tilted or why the solstice occurred, because what mattered was that the event returned, and that its return could be recognized. A gap in a wooden wall could preserve the memory of where the sun had appeared, turning a brief moment of light into something that could be anticipated and shared. There is a temptation to imagine places like this as ancient observatories populated by specialists whose work closely resembled later astronomy, but the evidence does not require such a picture. The enclosure may have been a gathering place, a ritual space, a seasonal marker, or something that combined all of those meanings in ways no modern label captures very well, because the people who built it were not obligated to separate observation from ceremony. The sun, setting through an opening at the edge of winter, could have confirmed the turning of the year, but usefulness alone does not explain why a community would surround that event with architecture. Gathering to witness the return of familiar light may itself have mattered, especially in a world where the darkest season carried real uncertainty, and the gradual lengthening of the day was felt not as an abstract calculation, but as a change in the conditions of life. Goseck also reminds us how incomplete the archaeological record can be, because wood disappears where stone endures, and entire traditions of ancient construction may have vanished simply because their materials returned to the earth. If some communities marked the heavens with timber rather than megaliths, then many of their monuments would leave behind little more than stains in the soil, while the great stone circles and passage tombs survived to dominate our imagination. The ancient world we inherit is therefore not a complete catalogue of what people created, but a selection shaped by preservation, and the relationship between architecture and the sky may once have been more widespread than the surviving monuments alone suggest. That possibility changes the way we think about knowledge moving through time, because a wooden post can rot, a wall can collapse, and a settlement can disappear, while the observation that inspired them may continue through memory or repeated practice long after the structure itself is gone. The sky offers a continuity that human buildings cannot, because the winter sun, seen by the people at Goseck, rose into a world very different from ours, yet its seasonal path remained recognizable enough that we can reconstruct what those builders were facing. Their original enclosure disappeared, but the horizon still allows us to understand the basic experience that may have given the place its meaning. By this point in our journey, a pattern is beginning to emerge without forcing every monument into a single explanation. Whether ancient builders worked with great stones, buried chambers, temple walls, or timber palisades, they created places where the movement of light could be encountered through architecture, and that shared attention tells us something important even when the beliefs behind it remain unknown. Ancient people did not merely live beneath the sky. In certain places, they shaped the ground so the sky could be noticed more carefully, turning the movement of the year into something a community could enter, witness, remember, and pass forward. Section 6. Far to the south of the monuments we have already visited, beyond the Nile Valley and deep into the desert of southern Egypt, lies a place that once looked very different from the landscape surrounding it today. Nabta Playa is now dry and severe, but during the early and middle Holocene, the region received far more seasonal rainfall, and shallow lakes periodically formed where only sand and stone remain now. Human communities returned to this basin over long stretches of time, bringing cattle and leaving behind traces of settlement and ceremony. It is within this older, greener Sahara that a small circle of stones and a wider field of megalithic features were created, thousands of years before the Great Pyramids rose farther north along the Nile, and their relationship with the sky has made Nabta Playa one of the most intriguing places in early human observation. The stone circle itself is modest when compared with Stonehenge, and there is something misleading about that modesty because its importance does not come from overwhelming scale. Researchers have argued that openings and sightlines within the circle were associated with the north and with the rising sun near the summer solstice, while other arrangements across the surrounding landscape have been interpreted as showing additional attention to the heavens. These interpretations remain debated, especially when possible stellar alignments are involved, because reconstructing an ancient sky and proving what a builder intended are not the same thing. Even so, the repeated orientations found at Nabta Playa have given archaeologists reason to consider the sky as part of the meaning of the site rather than treating the stones as random. What makes the summer sun especially interesting here is the world in which these people were living. In a dryland environment where seasonal rain could transform the landscape, the turning of the year was not merely an abstract pattern, and the approach of wetter conditions could carry consequences for water, pasture, animals, movement, and survival. If the position of the sun near the solstice helped anchor a season that communities already understood through experience, then watching the horizon may have joined the rhythms of the sky, with changes unfolding across the land. The stones would not have needed to predict rainfall with mechanical precision to matter, because their value could have come from placing a familiar celestial event within a landscape where people gathered repeatedly, allowing the return of the sun to become part of the return to Nabta itself. The wider archaeological setting makes it difficult to separate this attention to the heavens from ceremony and memory. Nabta Playa contains burials, including cattle burials, as well as larger stone features whose purposes remain uncertain, suggesting that this was not simply a campsite where someone happened to notice a sunrise. Whatever the full meaning of the place may have been, animals, landscape, and sky appear to have entered the same ceremonial world. Modern language encourages us to ask whether a structure was religious or practical, whether it was a calendar or a monument, but those choices may tell us more about the way we organize knowledge than about the way ancient communities experienced their surroundings. A stone that marked a seasonal sunrise could also belong to a place of gathering, burial, and belief without any contradiction at all. There is something fitting about finding such early evidence beneath the skies of the Sahara, because a desert night makes the heavens difficult to ignore. Away from modern light, the stars do not appear as a handful of bright points above darkness, but as a dense field stretching from horizon to horizon, while familiar patterns become recognizable through repeated nights of travel and rest. The people of Nabta Playa did not see exactly the same stellar sky that we see now, because the slow wobble of the Earth's axis changes the celestial background over immense spans of time, yet they lived beneath a sky governed by the same repeating motions, and learned to recognize enough of those motions to give some of them a place on the ground. Nabta Playa therefore carries our story farther back and into a different kind of landscape, where the relationship between monument and sky does not begin with towers, instruments, or written calculations, but with communities returning to a seasonal basin and learning its rhythms deeply enough that earth and sky could become part of the same remembered place. The surviving stones cannot tell us exactly what was said when people gathered there, or what they felt when the sun reached its turning point on the horizon, but they preserve the possibility that long before astronomy became a formal discipline, the heavens were already being folded into human memory and ceremony, one returning season at a time. Section 7. By now, the sun has followed us from monument to monument, appearing at entrances, between stones, and along carefully watched horizons, but the people who built these places did not live beneath a sky ruled by the sun alone. Night brought another world into view, where the moon rose from shifting points along the horizon and the stars turned in patterns across the darkness. Without artificial light, these movements would have been difficult to ignore, and some may have become as familiar as the seasonal path of the sun. The challenge for us is that the night sky leaves fewer obvious traces in architecture, because a sunrise entering a passage can still be observed directly, while an ancient stellar alignment may depend upon reconstructing a sky that has changed over thousands of years. That change matters because the stars do not remain perfectly fixed from the perspective of Earth. The slow wobble of our planet's axis, known today as precession, gradually alters their positions over immense spans of time, so a monument that seems poorly aligned with a star now may have faced it more closely when the structure was new. This possibility has inspired some of the boldest interpretations in archaeoastronomy, but it also demands caution, because once enough stars and architectural lines are considered, apparent matches can emerge almost by accident. A convincing argument requires more than drawing a line from a stone toward a bright point in the sky. Archaeologists must ask whether the relationship appears repeatedly and whether the wider sight gives us reason to think that part of the heavens mattered. The moon creates another puzzle because its movement along the horizon is more complicated than the sun's. Its rising and setting positions shift noticeably from night to night, and over a longer cycle, the extremes of that movement expand and contract before returning again years later. Ancient observers did not need to understand the mechanics behind this behavior to recognize that the moon wandered through patterns of its own, and a community watching the same horizon across generations could notice relationships that no single season would reveal. Some researchers have suggested that certain megalithic monuments may preserve attention to these lunar extremes, although such claims are more difficult to demonstrate than the clearest solstice alignments. Even where the evidence remains uncertain, the possibility reminds us that ancient sky watching may sometimes have demanded patience measured not only in months, but in years. The stars offered another kind of order because familiar patterns returned with the seasons, rising earlier or later as the year progressed until they disappeared into daylight and eventually came back again. For people moving across open landscapes, bright stars could provide direction, while the seasonal appearance of a familiar group might become associated with changes already unfolding on the ground. Yet the stars may also have belonged to stories, ancestors, animals, spirits, or sacred events, turning the night sky into something remembered not merely as a pattern of lights, but as a landscape of meaning. We know that later societies often joined practical observation with mythology, and although we cannot place those later beliefs into the minds of much earlier people, the possibility helps us understand why a particular star or direction might matter enough to be remembered. This is where the silence of prehistoric monuments becomes especially powerful, because the stones may preserve direction while losing the story that made that direction important. A passage could face a place where a star once rose, but without language, we may never know whether that star marked a season, guided a journey, represented an ancestor, or meant nothing at all. The temptation is always to complete the picture and imagine hidden systems or forgotten maps of the heavens, but a better approach allows some of the darkness to remain. Ancient people were capable observers, and some monuments clearly reveal attention to celestial cycles, yet their knowledge did not need to resemble modern astronomy in order to be sophisticated. Perhaps what mattered most was that the sky offered a continuity the human world could not. People were born and died, settlements shifted, wooden structures decayed, and generations passed, while the great movements overhead returned with a steadiness that seemed almost beyond time. The sun came back to its turning points, the moon changed and returned, and the stars wheeled through the darkness as they had before any living person could remember. To connect a monument with those movements was to place a human creation inside a rhythm far larger than a human life, and whether the builders understood that connection as memory, ceremony, navigation, or something we can no longer name, the night sky gave their stones a horizon beyond the earth beneath them. Section 8. The more closely we look at these monuments, the less mysterious the basic act of observing the sky becomes, because the first tools required for astronomy were not made of brass, glass, or mathematics, but of memory, patience, and a stable place from which to watch. A person standing on the same patch of ground at dawn could notice where the sun appeared against the horizon, and if that observation was repeated often enough, the slow movement of sunrise from one part of the year to another would begin to reveal itself. A stone, a post, a distant hill, or even the edge of a building could become a reference point, not because it contained any special power, but because it allowed one morning to be compared with another. Over time, the horizon itself could function like a scale, with the changing position of light marking the progress of the year in a way that did not depend upon written numbers. The same could be done with shadows, whose length and direction changed as the sun climbed and descended through the day and through the seasons. A vertical post placed in the ground would cast a shadow that moved continuously. And although we should be cautious about assigning specific instruments to cultures that left no record of them, the principle would have been impossible to miss. The sun left traces of its movement everywhere, on walls, on stones, across open ground, and within doorways, so the challenge was not discovering that the heavens changed, but learning which changes repeated reliably enough to be remembered. Once a community trusted those patterns, the observations could be passed forward until nobody needed to begin from the beginning, because each generation inherited the watching of the one before it. This may be one of the simplest ways to understand how ancient builders could create alignments that still surprise us now, because precision does not always require advanced technology when time itself is available as a measuring instrument. If the sun rises near the same extreme point each winter, then years of observation can refine that location, and if a monument is built toward that point, the architecture becomes a permanent extension of what the horizon had already taught. The knowledge may have been held by a small number of people or shared more broadly within the community, and we cannot know how formal the process became, but the essential method remains easy to imagine because it begins with something any human being can do: return, look again, and compare what has changed. What becomes remarkable is the decision to turn that observation into construction, because raising a monument meant converting a fleeting event into something that could be experienced collectively. A sunrise lasts only a short time, but a passage aligned toward it can wait for that light all year, and a stone positioned against the horizon can preserve a direction long after the person who first noticed it is gone. In this way, architecture could give permanence to knowledge that would otherwise live only in memory, and the monument itself could become a teacher, showing later generations where to stand, where to look, and when a familiar event was returning. Even if the stories surrounding that moment changed, the relationship between stone and sky could remain. There is also a quiet humility in this kind of knowledge, because it depends upon accepting that the world moves according to rhythms larger than any individual life. No single observer invented the solstice, and no builder caused the stars to return, yet human beings could learn the patterns well enough to place themselves within them. That may be why so many ancient monuments feel at once practical and ceremonial, because the act of measuring the heavens was also an act of entering into something that could not be controlled. The sun would rise whether anyone watched or not, but to recognize its return, gather beneath it, and shape a place around that moment was to make the cycle part of human memory. Seen this way, the mystery of ancient astronomy becomes less about secret knowledge and more about accumulated attention. We are accustomed to thinking of intelligence as something revealed through complicated tools, written calculations, and specialized language. Yet the builders of these monuments remind us that careful observation can become powerful when it is repeated across generations and anchored to a landscape. A horizon watched for decades can become a record, a shadow can become a clue, and a stone placed with intention can preserve an idea longer than any spoken explanation. The sky did not need to be conquered or fully understood for people to learn from it. It only needed to be watched long enough for its patterns to become familiar, and remembered long enough for those patterns to become part of the world people built. Section 9. Once the sky had become something a community could read, the knowledge held within those patterns may have taken on a social importance of its own, because knowing when a season was turning or when a familiar celestial event was approaching could shape more than private observation. In a world where survival depended upon timing, where journeys, gatherings, planting, hunting, or seasonal movement could all be affected by changes in weather and daylight, the ability to recognize repeating patterns would have been valuable even if nobody thought of it as a separate profession. Some people may simply have watched more carefully than others, remembered more faithfully, or inherited traditions that taught them which horizon mattered and which returning light was worth waiting for. And over generations, that kind of attention could become part of the authority of elders, ritual leaders, or other figures whose roles are now difficult to reconstruct. We should be cautious about imagining ancient astronomer priests standing beside every monument, because the evidence rarely allows us to identify such people with confidence. Yet, it is reasonable to think that knowledge was not distributed in exactly the same way among everyone. A community could share an understanding of the seasons while still relying on particular individuals to preserve stories, lead ceremonies, or remember the timing of important events. If a winter sunrise was connected with a gathering, then someone had to know when that gathering should begin, and if the return of a star was associated with movement across the landscape, then someone had to remember what that appearance meant. The sky could therefore become part of social memory, carried not only in stone, but in people whose responsibility was to notice and to teach. This may help explain why monumental construction could matter so deeply, because a structure aligned with the heavens did more than preserve information. It created a place where knowledge could be experienced together. A person standing alone could watch the sun rise, but a chamber that filled with light at a particular season allowed an entire community to witness the same event within a space already charged with memory and meaning. The monument turned observation into occasion, and occasion into tradition, so that what might once have been a quiet discovery on the horizon could become part of a recurring human rhythm. Each return of the sun, moon, or stars could confirm not only that the heavens remained ordered, but that the community itself still remembered how to recognize that order. There is something powerful in the idea that architecture could hold a society together across time, especially when we remember how fragile oral memory can be. Stories change, people die, settlements move, and languages disappear, yet a passage aimed toward the winter sunrise can continue to perform its role long after the words once spoken there are gone. The structure becomes a kind of silent instruction, telling future generations where to stand and what direction to face, even when the reasons for doing so begin to change. A monument can therefore preserve both continuity and transformation, because later people may inherit the place without inheriting the exact beliefs of its builders, adding new meanings to an alignment that was already ancient when they encountered it. This is one reason the ancient landscape should not be imagined as a collection of isolated ruins, each belonging to a single moment and a single purpose. Many sites were used, rebuilt, revisited, and reinterpreted over long periods of time, which means that the relationship between people and the sky may also have changed while the stones remained in place. A sunrise that began as a seasonal marker could later become part of a funerary ritual, a story about ancestors, or a ceremony whose original explanation had already been forgotten, and none of those later meanings would erase the older relationship beneath them. Human beings rarely inherit the past unchanged. They live inside it, adapt it, and make it useful again. Seen from this perspective, the megalithic monuments become less like frozen puzzles and more like stages upon which generations encountered the same recurring heavens. Their importance may have come not from one perfect interpretation, but from their ability to gather memory, season, ceremony, and community into a single place where the sky could be watched together. The builders may have understood the heavens through ideas very different from ours. Yet the act itself remains recognizable because people still gather beneath eclipses, solstices, meteor showers, and other rare skies to experience something larger in the company of others. Long before written astronomy, the sky could already create occasions, and in ancient landscapes shaped by stone, those occasions may have helped turn observation into belonging. Section 10. As we move deeper into these ancient landscapes, another possibility begins to emerge because the monuments may not have been built merely to point at the sky so much as to place human life within it. A stone circle, a passage tomb, or a temple does more than create a marker on the ground. It changes the way a person experiences the horizon, the light, and the movement above. Once architecture begins to frame the sky, sunrise is no longer something happening everywhere at once, but something that arrives through a particular opening, between particular stones, or along a path chosen by human hands. The heavens remain vast and unreachable, yet the monument gives them a doorway into the human world, allowing a distant event to become part of a place that can be entered, remembered, and returned to. This may help explain why so many of these structures seem inseparable from the landscapes around them. Their meaning was not confined to the stones themselves, because the hills, rivers, ridges, coastlines, and distant horizons could become part of the design simply by being seen from the right position. A builder did not need to reshape an entire landscape to make use of it. A natural rise on the horizon could mark where the sun appeared, while a valley could open toward a direction that already held seasonal importance. In that sense, the monument and the land could work together, with architecture turning features of the surrounding world into part of a larger pattern. The sky was not observed from nowhere. It was always seen from a place, and that place could become meaningful precisely because the heavens behaved differently when viewed from there. For people whose lives were tied closely to local ground, this connection may have been far more immediate than it feels to us now. Modern travel allows us to cross enormous distances without learning the shape of the horizon, and artificial light often hides the night sky almost completely. But ancient communities could spend generations within the same valleys, plains, islands, or river systems. Over time, the landscape would become familiar in a way that is difficult to reproduce, with certain hills associated with sunrise, certain routes followed in particular seasons, and certain places remembered through story or ceremony. When a monument was added to that world, it did not stand apart from nature as a separate object. It became another layer within a landscape that was already full of memory. This is also why the phrase ancient astronomy can sometimes be too narrow, even when the sky clearly mattered. We use astronomy to describe the observation and study of celestial objects, but an ancient community might have understood the same movements through a world in which the land, the dead, the seasons, and the heavens belonged to one continuous order. The sun entering a chamber might have marked a turning point in the year, while also connecting that place with ancestors buried within it. And the return of a star might have carried both practical and ceremonial meaning, without anyone feeling the need to choose between the two. What we call observation may have been inseparable from belonging, because to know the sky was also to know when to gather, where to stand, what stories to remember, and how one generation fitted into the cycles that had outlasted all of them. The monuments themselves may have reinforced that feeling because stone creates an impression of permanence that human life cannot match. A person could watch a solstice only a limited number of times, but a structure aligned toward that event could wait through centuries of winters, receiving the same returning light long after its builders were gone. That endurance may have given the architecture a kind of authority, not because the stones understood the heavens, but because they seemed to remain in relationship with them. The same opening still faced the same part of the horizon, the same chamber still darkened and brightened, and the same distant movements returned regardless of who was alive to witness them. Seen in this way, these sites were not simply machines for measuring celestial events, nor were they only monuments decorated with astronomical symbolism. They may have been places where people experienced the larger order of the world through architecture, where stone, landscape, and sky were brought together until the distinction between observing a cycle and participating in it became difficult to separate. We cannot know exactly how the builders understood that experience, but the surviving structures suggest that the heavens were not something distant from human life. They were above every journey, every burial, every harvest, and every gathering, and in certain places, ancient communities chose to build as though the sky itself were part of the architecture. Section 11. The farther we travel through these ancient landscapes, the more important it becomes to remember how much of their meaning has been lost, because the stones remain while the explanations that once surrounded them have disappeared. We can measure an entrance, reconstruct an ancient horizon, calculate where the sun or moon would have risen, and compare one monument with another, but none of those methods can recover a vanished ceremony or tell us what a particular beam of light meant to the people who waited for it. This is one of the central difficulties of studying the ancient sky, because physical alignment and human intention are not the same thing. A doorway may face the winter sunrise because that event mattered deeply, or because the landscape encouraged the building to face that direction, and every interpretation becomes stronger only when several kinds of evidence support the same conclusion. That uncertainty has not always been treated carefully. Ancient monuments have long attracted theories that promise a single hidden answer, often imagining forgotten sciences, lost civilizations, or knowledge so advanced that ordinary observation could not possibly explain it. Such ideas are attractive because they make the past feel more mysterious, but they can also diminish the people who actually built these places by assuming that patience, memory, cooperation, and close attention were somehow not enough. The builders of Stonehenge did not need modern instruments to recognize the solstice, just as the people at Newgrange did not need to understand orbital mechanics to know where the winter sun would return. What they needed was continuity, the willingness to watch the same horizon across many years and preserve what had been learned until observation became tradition and tradition became architecture. The more difficult mystery is not how ancient people could have noticed these patterns, but why certain patterns mattered enough to deserve stone, labor, ceremony, and generations of care. That question cannot be solved by geometry alone, because a line between a monument and the horizon tells us direction, not meaning. Even when an alignment is unmistakable, we are still left wondering what people believed was happening at that moment and why they chose to gather there. A returning sunrise might have represented renewal, ancestry, order, survival, or something that does not fit neatly into any modern category, and the most responsible answer is often to admit that several possibilities may remain open at once. The silence is frustrating, but it is also honest, because the ancient world does not owe us a complete explanation simply because we have inherited its ruins. There is another reason to be cautious, and it lies in the human tendency to find patterns wherever we look. Given enough stones, stars, and possible sightlines, some apparent connections will occur by chance, especially when we begin selecting only the examples that fit what we hope to find. This is why the strongest cases are those in which the relationship is built into the structure itself, repeated across features, or supported by the wider archaeological setting, while weaker claims depend upon a single line drawn between distant points. The distinction may seem less dramatic, but it protects the real achievements of ancient builders from being buried beneath speculation, and when the evidence is strong, it deserves to feel extraordinary precisely because we have not exaggerated it. Perhaps this is where the deeper wonder of these places survives. The sky was not hidden from ancient people, and neither was the passage of time, but they experienced both without the layers of technology that now stand between us and the natural world. They could learn the year by watching light change across the land, recognize direction by the movement above them, and attach memory to places that generations would continue to revisit. What seems mysterious to us may sometimes have been ordinary knowledge to them, while what seems obvious to us may have carried meanings we can no longer recover. The gap between those two worlds is not something archaeology can completely close. As this chapter approaches its end, the monuments begin to feel less like riddles waiting for a final solution and more like traces of a long human conversation with the heavens. Some of that conversation can still be heard in the way sunlight enters a chamber or falls between stones, while much of it has faded into silence. We are left with enough evidence to know that the sky mattered, enough uncertainty to prevent easy answers, and enough surviving beauty to understand why people continue returning to these places thousands of years later. The stones remain fixed beneath a moving sky, and in that contrast lies much of their power, because every generation that stands among them becomes another brief observer in a pattern far older than any one human life. Section 12. By the time we return from these distant monuments, the question that first drew us toward them has changed. At the beginning, it was easy to wonder whether ancient builders possessed some lost knowledge of the heavens, but the closer we look, the less necessary that idea becomes. What emerges instead is quieter, human beings watching the same sky until its patterns became familiar, then carrying those patterns into the places they built. The achievement was not that they escaped the limits of their time, but that they used attention, memory, cooperation, and patience so effectively that parts of what they learned remain visible thousands of years later. A solstice sunrise entering a chamber or a sunset framed between stones can seem almost magical when we encounter it today, yet the wonder does not depend upon mystery for its power. The sun was visible to everyone, but noticing a pattern is different from preserving it, and preserving it is different again from building an entire place around it. Somewhere between those acts lies the real achievement of these monuments. A community had to decide that a certain direction mattered, that a certain moment in the year was worth remembering, and that the memory should be given a form strong enough to outlast the people who first carried it. Once stone or timber had taken that role, the monument could continue waiting for the sky long after the original observers were gone. That may be why these places still feel strangely alive even in ruin, because they were never complete without movement above them. A ring of stones beneath an empty sky is only part of the experience, just as a dark passage without the returning sun is only part of what its builders intended. The monuments existed inside cycles, and those cycles continued while everything human around them changed. Empires rose and disappeared, languages vanished, landscapes shifted, and generations passed beneath the same turning heavens. Yet the sun still reaches the solstice horizon, and the stars still move through the night. The builders could not have known who would stand among their stones thousands of years later, but they built within patterns that were already older than memory. There is a kind of humility in that realization, because it places these ancient communities neither beneath us nor above us, but beside us in the same long human habit of looking upward and trying to understand where we are. We possess instruments that can measure distances they could never have imagined, and models that explain motions they could only observe. Yet the first impulse remains familiar. We still notice the moon when it hangs unusually low, step outside for an eclipse, travel to dark places to see stars hidden by city light, and gather when the sky does something rare enough to remind us of the world beyond our daily concerns. Many ancient communities simply lived with that awareness more constantly, beneath nights where the heavens were not an occasional spectacle, but a permanent part of the landscape. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson contained in the stones. They do not prove that every ancient society shared one system of astronomy, and they do not reveal a forgotten civilization that understood the universe as we do now. What they reveal is the persistence of observation, the ability of communities to recognize order without explaining every mechanism behind it, and the desire to give that order a place in human life. Sometimes that place was a passage beneath a mound, sometimes a circle on an open plain, sometimes a temple facing the dawn, but the larger pattern remained the same. People noticed what returned and found ways to remember it. So when we stand before these monuments and ask what ancient builders understood, the answer may be both simpler and larger than we expect. They understood enough to know that the sky was not random, enough to recognize that light and darkness moved in recurring patterns, and enough to trust those patterns across generations. They understood that memory could be placed into landscapes, and that a moment in the heavens could become part of a human gathering on the ground. Beyond that, some meanings remain silent, and perhaps they always will. The stones cannot tell us every story spoken around them, but they can still point our attention in the same direction their builders once looked. And so the chapter ends not with a solved mystery, but with an image that may be closer to the truth. People standing beneath an immense night sky, waiting for something they knew would return. They had watched before, and others had watched before them, until expectation became tradition, and tradition became part of the landscape itself. The monument held its place. The horizon held its line, and eventually the light came back exactly where memory said it would. And now, seekers, our journey beneath the ancient sky comes to an end. Tonight, we followed the traces left behind by people who watched the heavens long before astronomy had a name, people who learned the slow movement of the sun, the changing path of the moon, and the return of familiar stars, simply by paying attention across seasons and generations. In stone circles, passage tombs, temples, and forgotten enclosures, they gave those observations a physical form, not always because they wished to measure the sky in the way we do today, but because the heavens had become part of memory, ceremony, place, and the rhythm of life itself. Much of what they believed has disappeared with them, and perhaps that is why these monuments still hold such power, because enough remains to show us where they looked without ever fully telling us what they saw. The stones are quiet now, but the sky above them continues to move exactly as it did when the first builders stood beneath it. The winter sun still reaches the edge of the horizon, the moon still changes through the night, and the stars continue their slow turning while one generation gives way to another. Somewhere in that continuity lies the most enduring part of their story, because although the people are gone, the patterns they learn to recognize are still there, waiting for anyone patient enough to look. The narration will end here, but you do not need to leave the archive just yet. Our own music from the scholar's study will now continue for a while longer, with no more words to follow, only a quiet place to remain as the night carries on. Whether you are already drifting toward sleep or simply listening in the darkness, allow the music to take over from here and let the rest of the evening move at its own pace. Until we meet again in the next chapter of the Book of Ancient Worlds, rest well, seekers.